The basis for our sermon this morning is the gospel reading, Mark 9, verses 30 to 37 for you confirmands working on your sermon notes right now. We got some great readings. It's LWML Sunday. We have the Old Testament reading that talks about Jesus being that lamb led to slaughter for you and for me. And we have that epistle reading from James talking about God opposing the proud, but lifting up, but giving grace to the humble. Our theme for this morning is being mini muffins for the Lord. Let's take another look at that gospel reading. Take out your Bibles if you have them this morning and turn to Mark chapter 9. Mark's nestled right there between Matthew and Luke. If you notice, you may have picked up on this by now, but I like to look at the area around our reading, not just 30 to 37, but look around it to help us find out where Mark and God are trying to lead us this morning. Now, as you look, the verses leading up to verse 30 there, it talks about the healing of a boy with an evil spirit. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but the Reader's Digest version is that the disciples try to heal this little boy with an evil spirit, and it doesn't work. So the parents go pull rank on them and go straight to Jesus and say, "Look, your disciples tried to heal our son and it didn't work." And you can imagine how that must have felt for the disciples at that point. Someone's gone over your head when it didn't work in the first place. So they're feeling about that big. And later on, you can tell they're embarrassed because later on, they wait till they're in private and they ask Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, what went wrong?" And right there in verse 29, Jesus tells them that this kind of evil spirit can only come out by prayer. So that's what's leading right up to our gospel reading. We get to verse 30 and they're leaving that place. And Jesus isn't taking care of their wounded egos. He isn't just trying to help them out. Nope. He just jumps right in and does what he needs to do. He says, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." Sort of like a gospel in a sentence right there in verse 31. And the disciples, they don't get it. But that's okay. They will later. And you can tell they don't get it by what happens next. They're walking along the road, and when they get to the house they were going to, Jesus says, "So, what were you talking about?" And it's really quiet, awkwardly quiet. You know, I just got back from a pastor's conference, and let me tell you, I can count on one hand the number of times it was quiet. Pastors, disciples just haven't been good at being quiet, and I'm sure these disciples were no exception. In fact, these disciples were converted fishermen. And what do we think of with fishermen? We don't think of quiet. We think of exaggerated stories about the fish that got away. So, yeah, it's awkward. Poor disciples are having a rough day here. And Mark tells us why. They kept quiet because on the way they'd argued about who was the greatest. Or, to go back to the children's sermon, who was the mightiest muffin. We'll be getting back to that, don't worry. And so, what does Jesus do with this whole mighty muffin controversy? Well, he sits them down. He sees a teachable moment. He sits them down and says, if anyone wants to be first, they must be the last, the servant of all. That's verse 35. And he illustrates this with an example of a child. Now, children back then didn't have DCF. They didn't have all the Department of Children and Families. Sorry. When you work in the preschool area, you get these acronyms that you just know. They didn't have sort of the protections that we have now. They had their family. That's it. They didn't have power. They didn't have the protection that our children enjoy today. And so they were really powerless. And Jesus takes a little child, has him stand amongst the disciples who are sitting, And then he takes the child into his arms and says, whoever welcomes one of these little children, these powerless little children, in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me, God the Father. You know, what the disciples were struggling with, the mighty muffin, was what I call the mighty muffin syndrome. That assumption that bigger is always better. And just so you know, in the early service, I polled the adults, and they came up with the same answer. The people voted for the mighty muffin, not the mini muffin. So I call it mini muffin syndrome whenever we're trying to define our lives by that mantra of bigger is better. Of course, it's really easy to see in kids. And, the kids that it's all about who has the coolest shoes, or the coolest backpack, or you got to have the coolest toys, or, this happens, who has the coolest lunch. Yeah. It's so funny when the little kids come up to you to prove that they are the mighty muffin, based on whatever happens to be the most exciting thing in their life at that point. But, I wish I could say that we grow out of mighty muffin syndrome when we grow up. But let's face it, we adults, we struggle with the mighty muffin syndrome too. We begin looking at those things, bigger is better. You got to have whoever has the coolest car, the coolest house, or the house in the right community, or on the correct side of the Calusa River, whatever it is, we still, as adults, struggle with this mighty muffin syndrome. And what I don't think we realize is that as we lift ourselves up, we wind up pushing other people down. And while that becomes harmful on the individual basis, it really gets painful when we start talking about the mighty muffin church. At our pastors' conference, we talked about this book called Unchristian that polled a lot of people who are outside of the church, who do not have a saving relationship with Christ, and just wanted to find out what are those things that make them say no thank you at best to the church. And it's interesting. They talked about the mighty muffin church. It's bigger is always better. If you think about it, you've heard some of these things said, like, how many people worship at your church? Or, how big is your church? And not surprisingly, the research done for that book Unchristian showed the similar thing. That these people outside the church were saying they didn't want a mighty muffin church. And they felt that Christians too often are anti-gay, are judgmental, are hypocritical, and a number of other things. All mighty muffin and putting other people down to prove how big we are. And that's not just America. That's not just Florida. It's all around the globe. I was shocked to find out, with a world population of 7 billion, how many do you think are Christians? I was shocked that according to our best research, 2 billion have a saving relationship with Christ. That means that 5 billion people do not. For those of you who are number-oriented, that's 71%. That's scary. 71% of the people are saying, no thank you to the Mighty Muffin Church. In fact, when we act like the Mighty Muffin Church, we're not just hurting ourselves or each other, we're driving people away from God, away from faith. So where do we go with the whole Mighty Muffin syndrome? Well, let's see what Jesus does with the disciples. Looking back at verse 35, Jesus says to the disciples, if anyone wants to be the first, he must be the mightiest.